So now we're going to talk a little bit about healthy relationships, a biblical point of view. I would contend not to be too limiting, but certainly a Lucan perspective on this, right? So Jesus is teaching in Luke chapter 10, and this person is called a lawyer or a scribe. This person's an expert in the Jewish law. Stands up and asks Jesus, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus very deftly turns the question around on him. What's written in the law? What does it tell you? Well, this lawyer knows. He says, well, you got to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and you have to love your neighbor as yourself. This is straight out of Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5, which is known as the Shema, from the Hebrew word Shema, which means hear. And it begins, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one," right? And then it goes on to say, you shall love the Lord your God completely, heart, soul, mind, right? And then in Leviticus chapter 19, by the way, I kind of like the book of Leviticus. Many people find it boring, but I don't. I think that whole sacrificial system in the first 7 chapters of Leviticus is, I think it's fascinating reading, but I know I'm a little weird. Anyway, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And that's what this man answers. Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. That, my friends, is the guts of healthy relationships. Healthy relationships within I think it's more than just a theological perspective. I think it's more than just spirituality, but it impacts spirituality. How do I love God, whom I've not seen, the writer of 1 John asked, when I don't love my neighbor who I have seen? How do I love God if I don't love humanity? That's a great question. I'm still waiting for an answer because I haven't figured out how to do that. If you figured it out, you're a better person than I just don't think you can do it. I don't think you can say, I love God and hate your neighbor, or be indifferent, which may be even worse than hating your neighbor. So anyway, so Jesus said, yeah, you've said right. And this lawyer wants to trip Jesus up. I know that we never have had that experience with lawyers, and I will resist the temptation to tell lawyer jokes. I've got friends who are attorneys, and they love them, but not everybody does, so I'm not going to tell a joke right now. But then this guy asked Jesus, who's my neighbor? And what does Jesus do? He tells him a story, the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, here's the thing about that Samaritan dude. He represents everything that is hated in this society. So, who's the star of the story? Well, it's not the priest that goes walking by after the guy has been injured in the robbery. It's not the Levite, who is a religious official as well, that walks by and leaves this guy bleeding and dying. It's the Samaritan. It is the outcast. It is the one who you would not expect to be compassionate. At least they didn't. Right? And Jesus has him be the star of the story. Why? Because he wants to make the point that healthy relationships have something to do with honoring the spirit of the law rather than just the outer command of the law not to be defiled or made unclean, which the priest and the Levite, they knew the law. They probably would have been defiled by helping this guy out. They would have been ritually impure. And Jesus says, the one that does God's will, the one that has a healthy relationship with humanity, is the one that gets their hands dirty and doesn't worry about ritual cleanliness, but sees instead the fallenness, the brokenness, the jeopardy with which this particular person was impacted by this robbery. And then takes care of him takes him somewhere that's an inn, but it becomes like the equivalent of a hospital, right? And pays his bill. And so the question, who then is neighbor? And that's the way Jesus ends it. Who's the neighbor? And the lawyer says, well, the one who showed mercy. What does Jesus say? Go and do the same thing. That is a healthy relationship with others. It is getting our hands dirty, doing what is certainly not convenient, but what is necessary. How that looks all the time, I don't know. It's difficult. It's difficult to tell. But I know this. I know that a healthy relationship with God is reflected by having a healthy relationship with others around us. Love God, love your neighbor. That's the Lucan perspective. I think it's Jesus' perspective. And I would argue, I think it's God's perspective.